On July 14, 1941, a German machine gunner named Hans Kinchermann crouched behind a rail embankment at the Orsha railway junction in eastern Belarus. He had spent 3 weeks pushing east through Soviet territory, and his unit had just taken the station. Trains loaded with fuel and ammunition sat on the tracks. Things were going well. Then, without any warning at all, the sky began to scream. Dozens of bright streaks tore across the horizon, trailing white smoke, and in less than 10 seconds, the station erupted into a wall of fire. Kinchermann would later describe it as a real hell. Fire and red-hot metal falling from the sky, with no escape anywhere. The German troops broke and ran. Those who survived had no idea what had just hit them. There were no gun flashes on the horizon, no thunder of artillery barrels, just that sound. A wailing, howling shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the sky itself was being torn apart. The Wehrmacht had just met the Katyusha, and the Eastern Front would never sound the same again. The German officers at Orsha were baffled. Their intelligence units had no record of any Soviet weapon capable of this kind of saturation fire. There were no artillery craters in the usual sense, because these were not artillery shells. There were no gun positions to locate through counter-battery fire, because there were no guns. The chief of the Wehrmacht's general staff, Franz Halder, noted the incident in his personal diary. The German intelligence service scrambled to figure out what the Soviets had just unleashed. Their conclusion in those first days was essentially a shrug. They had never seen anything like it, and they had no idea how it worked. This confused response was the first official acknowledgement by the German military that something fundamentally new had appeared on the battlefield. And the men who had built it were not celebrated generals or famous scientists. They were a handful of rocket engineers working out of a laboratory that most of the Soviet military had ignored for years. To understand how a weapon this devastating wound up sitting on the back of ordinary trucks, you have to go back to that research laboratory in Leningrad during the late 1930s. That is where Soviet engineers at the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, known by its Russian acronym RNII, were experimenting with rocket propulsion. The institute had been working on solid fuel rockets since the early 1920s, starting with designs intended for aircraft. The RS-82 and RS-132 were air-launched rockets, originally built for Soviet ground attack planes to fire at enemy positions during strafing runs. They worked well enough in the air, but a few of the engineers began wondering whether these same rockets could be adapted for use from the ground. The idea was straightforward. If you could mount a rack of launch rails on the back of a truck, you could fire a dozen or more rockets in a single burst and drive away before the enemy figured out where the attack came from. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, everything went wrong. The first prototype had launch rails mounted sideways across the truck bed. When the rockets ignited, the recoil nearly flipped the vehicle. The next design used a different configuration, but the rockets scattered wildly and could not hit a target with any consistency. Soviet artillery officers watched these tests and walked away unimpressed. They ran the numbers and pointed out that it took up to 50 minutes to load and fire 24 rockets from one of these launchers, while a standard howitzer could put 95 to 150 rounds downrange in the same amount of time. And the howitzer could actually hit what it was aiming at. The rockets could not. Accuracy was terrible. Range deviation at 5,500 meters was over 250 meters in one direction and 51 meters in the other. By conventional artillery standards, that was a joke. And there was something else working against the program that had nothing to do with engineering. In the late 1930s, Stalin's Great Purge swept through Soviet institutions, and the RNII was not spared. Several of the key engineers and directors who had pioneered the original rocket research were arrested by the NKVD, accused of being saboteurs or enemies of the state. Ivan Klimyonov, who had directed the institute, was executed in 1938. Georgy Langemak, one of the most talented rocket scientists in the country, was shot the same year. Boris Petropavlovsky, another founding figure, had already died. The Purges decapitated the very program that would later produce the Katyusha. The surviving engineers had to keep working under the shadow of knowing that their colleagues had been dragged away and killed for no reason, and that any perceived failure could bring the same fate to them. It is a grim piece of context that rarely gets mentioned alongside the weapon's success. But one engineer, V.N. Galkovsky, proposed a design that would change everything. Instead of mounting the rails sideways, he positioned them lengthwise along the truck chassis, firing forward over the cab. This configuration was far more stable. By August of 1939, the team had produced the BM-13, short for Boyovaya Mashina, or combat vehicle, fitted with rails for the improved M13 rocket. This rocket was about 80 centimeters long, just over 13 centimeters in diameter, and weighed 42 kilograms. More testing followed through 1940. The results were mixed but promising enough that the BM-1316, a model with 16 launch rails, was authorized for production. But the Soviet military establishment still treated the project like a sideshow. By the time Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, only 40 Katyusha launchers existed in the entire Soviet Union. 40. For a country about to fight the largest land war in human history. Here is what makes the timing so strange. The final decision to approve mass production of the Katyusha was signed on June 21, 1941, one day before the German invasion. Just hours before Wehrmacht tanks crossed the Soviet border, Joseph Stalin himself gave the green light. Top Soviet officials had watched a demonstration of the weapon shortly before. Initially, the device sitting on the back of a simple truck did not impress them much. Then it fired. Defense Minister Semyon Timoshenko was reportedly so stunned by the blast that the first thing he did was turn to his deputy and demand to know why nobody had told him about this weapon sooner. But approving production and actually having the weapons ready for combat are two very different things. With the German army smashing through Soviet defenses at terrifying speed, there was no time to wait for factories to ramp up output. So the Red Army did something desperate. They took those 40 existing launchers and sent them to the front immediately. The weapon was classified at the highest level of Soviet military secrecy. Every launcher was fitted with an explosive self-destruct charge so it could be blown up rather than captured. The soldiers who operated them were not told what the weapon was actually called. Its official designation, BM-13, did not appear in any document, even classified ones, until 1942. Instead, the launchers were referred to by code names. Some called them Kostikov guns, after the head of the RNII. Officially, they were classified as Guards mortars, a deliberately misleading name to hide the fact that these were rocket artillery. The crews knew the launchers came from the Comintern factory in the city of Voronezh, and the letter K was stamped on the frames. So the soldiers started calling them Katyusha, after a hugely popular wartime song about a young woman longing for her soldier who had gone off to defend the border. The name stuck. It is one of those rare cases in military history where a weapon's nickname tells you more about the people who used it than any technical manual ever could. The man tasked with taking these new weapons into combat was Captain Ivan Andreevich Flerov. His battery consisted of 7 BM-13 launchers mounted on ZIS-6 trucks, along with about 600 BM-13 rockets, an ammunition platoon, a transport platoon, and one conventional 122mm howitzer for fire direction. 2 civilian engineers from the development program, A.I. Popov and D.A. Shaitov, rode along with the battery to help train the crews. They had exactly 4 days of preparation before heading to the front. The battery was given a special tank escort to protect it as it moved through territory that was already being contested by German advance units. The secrecy around these trucks was extraordinary. NKVD state police detachments guarded the launchers at all times. If a vehicle broke down and could not be recovered, it was to be destroyed on the spot. No exceptions. The journey to the front was itself a dangerous operation. Flerov's convoy moved through roads already clogged with retreating Soviet troops and refugees fleeing the German advance. The launchers were covered with canvas tarpaulins to prevent anyone, including friendly soldiers, from seeing what was underneath. At checkpoints and rest stops, NKVD guards surrounded the vehicles and kept everyone at a distance. The civilian engineers traveling with the battery were essentially acting as last resort instructors because the weapon was so new and so secret that almost nobody in the Soviet military had any experience with it. If a launcher malfunctioned during combat, Popov and Shaitov were the only people who could fix it. The weight of what this small convoy was carrying, both in military terms and in the pressure of secrecy, was enormous. These 7 trucks represented the entire operational inventory of the most advanced rocket weapon on the planet. On July 14, 1941, Flerov's battery reached a position near the Orsha railway junction, which the Wehrmacht had recently captured. German troops and equipment were concentrated at the station. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, 6 of the 7 launchers opened fire. One launcher had suffered a damaged firing cable and could not shoot. The remaining 6 fired simultaneously, sending 112 rockets screaming toward the station in under 10 seconds. The result was total devastation. The railway junction, along with the German trains, fuel stores, and ammunition sitting on the tracks, was engulfed in a storm of high explosive fragmentation. A second salvo of 94 rockets followed roughly 2 hours later. The station, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. The effect on the German soldiers was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. These were not conventional artillery shells falling one at a time. This was a wall of screaming fire arriving all at once, covering an area of roughly 400,000 square meters in shrapnel and burning metal. The rockets made a distinct howling wail as they flew, created by air passing over the fin stabilizers at high speed. To the soldiers on the receiving end, it sounded like the sky was screaming. German troops gave the weapon a name of their own. They called it the Stalinorgel, Stalin's organ. The arrangement of parallel launch rails on the truck looked like the pipes of a church pipe organ, and the sound was something between a moan and a shriek that carried for kilometers. Reports from captured German soldiers described men losing their composure entirely. One captured corporal during the Soviet counteroffensive later that year said there were many cases of soldiers going mad from the rocket launcher fire. This is where the Katyusha's real advantage became clear. It was not accurate. Everyone, including the Soviets, acknowledged that. A standard artillery gun could place a shell within meters of its target. A Katyusha rocket could land hundreds of meters from where it was aimed. But accuracy was not the point. The point was saturation. A battery of 4 Katyusha launchers could deliver the equivalent firepower of 70 heavy artillery guns across a 1.5 square mile area in less than 30 seconds. Then the trucks could drive away before the enemy had any chance of locating the firing position and striking back. The Germans had their own rocket weapon, the Nebelwerfer, a 6-barrel mortar. But the Nebelwerfer could not deploy as many rockets as a Katyusha battery. It was not mobile, it had a shorter range, and when it fired, it left a long, visible smoke trail in the sky that pointed right back to the launch position like a sign reading "Shoot here." The Katyusha's rockets, by contrast, were designed with a propellant that left minimal trace. By the time the explosion started, the trucks were already moving. The tactic that made the Katyusha so effective had a simple name: shoot and scoot. A battery of trucks would drive to a pre-selected firing position, usually behind a hill or tree line, crank the launch rails to the correct elevation, fire a full salvo in under 10 seconds, then immediately start their engines and relocate before enemy observers could triangulate the source. By the time the first German counter-battery shells landed on the firing position, the Katyusha trucks were already a kilometer away. Traditional artillery could not do this. A conventional gun battery took considerable time to set up, aim, fire, and then displace. The Katyusha traded precision for speed and volume, and in the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, that trade paid off again and again. The Soviets also learned to concentrate their rocket batteries for maximum shock effect. Instead of spreading launchers across the front, They would mass dozens of trucks in a single area, fire simultaneously, and obliterate everything within the target zone in one overwhelming burst. The Germans had no good counter to this approach. After the success at Orsha, the Soviet High Command ordered immediate expansion of the rocket artillery program. New batteries were formed and rushed to the front as fast as production could keep pace. But the war was going badly for the Soviet Union in the summer and fall of 1941. The Wehrmacht was advancing deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies. Captain Flerov's battery continued fighting through August and September, supporting defensive actions around Smolensk and along the road to Moscow. Then, in early October of 1941, disaster struck. Flerov's unit was caught in the massive German encirclement at Vyazma, roughly 300 kilometers west of Moscow. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were trapped in what the Germans called a kessel, a cauldron. Flerov's trucks became bogged down in marshy terrain. The battery was out of ammunition. German units were closing in from all sides. Flerov knew what he had to do. His orders were clear, and they had been from the very first day. Under no circumstances could the launchers fall into German hands. He ordered his men to fire every remaining rocket, then destroy the launchers with the explosive charges built into each vehicle. The trucks were blown apart. The surviving crew members attempted to break through the German encirclement on foot. Fewer than a third of the battery made it out alive. Captain Ivan Flerov was not among them. He was killed in action during the breakout, either from wounds sustained in combat or during the destruction of his own launchers. The accounts differ. He was posthumously awarded the Order of the Patriotic War, and decades later, in 1995, he was named a Hero of Russia. The Germans were reportedly so desperate to capture a Katyusha intact that the famous Nazi commando Otto Skorzeny was allegedly assigned to the task. But for a long time, they could not get their hands on one. The Soviets were simply too thorough about destroying disabled launchers. When the Germans did finally examine captured components, they discovered a problem. They could not replicate the special solid rocket propellant the Soviets used. The formula provided stable and consistent thrust without leaving a visible exhaust trail, and German chemists could not figure out how to reproduce it. While Flerov's story was ending at Vyazma, the Katyusha's story was just beginning. Soviet factories, many of them relocated east of the Ural Mountains to escape the German advance, began churning out launchers and rockets at an accelerating rate. The beauty of the Katyusha was that it did not require the heavy industrial tooling needed to manufacture conventional artillery barrels. A factory that made farm equipment or basic metal fabrication could produce Katyusha launch rails. The rockets were similarly simple. By the end of 1942, the Soviet Union had built over 3,200 Katyusha launchers. Around 200 factories were involved in the production effort. 12 million rockets would be manufactured before the war's end. In 1943, the production program got an unexpected boost from an unlikely source. The American Studebaker US-6, a 2.5-ton 6x6 cargo truck, arrived in the Soviet Union as part of the Lend-Lease program. Soviet engineers immediately recognized its value. The Studebaker's cross-country performance was outstanding, far superior to the original Soviet Ziz trucks the Katyushas had been mounted on. The Studebaker became the standard chassis for Katyusha launchers, designated BM-13N, with the N standing for Normalizovany, meaning standardized. More than 1,800 of these Studebaker-mounted Katyushas were built by the end of the war. It is one of the more interesting footnotes of World War II that one of the most feared Soviet weapons rode into battle on the back of an American truck. The Katyusha was not just bolted onto trucks, either. Soviet engineers mounted the launchers on artillery tractors, on T-40 and T-60 light tank chassis, on armored trains, and on riverine gunboats for assault support during river crossings. In urban combat, they mounted single rockets on short sections of railway track, turning them into improvised point-blank weapons for street fighting. During the Battle of Stalingrad, in the winter of 1942 and 43, batteries of Katyusha launchers ringed the city. The sound of their rockets, combined with Soviet loudspeakers blaring propaganda messages and the so-called Tango of Death, became part of the psychological siege that ground down the German Sixth Army. Every 7 seconds a German soldier dies, the loudspeakers repeated, punctuated by the tick of a clock and the distant howl of incoming Katyusha salvos. For the surrounded and starving German troops, already low on food, ammunition, and hope, it was relentless. Sleep was nearly impossible. The rockets could come at any hour. The Soviets also developed new variants to fill different roles. The BM-8 used a smaller 82mm rocket and was light enough to be mounted on American Willys Jeeps received through Lend-Lease. The BM-31 fired a much larger 310mm rocket from a rack of tubes instead of rails, delivering massive warheads against fortified positions. The BM-31 was heavy and slow to reload, but each rocket carried far more explosive than the standard M13 round. Soviet soldiers called the BM-31 Andriusha, an affectionate nickname for Andrew, as a companion to the Katyusha name. Together, these variants gave the Red Army a family of rocket weapons for different situations, from light mobile harassment to concentrated demolition fire. By the time the war shifted in the Soviet Union's favor after 1943, the Katyusha had become a standard fixture of Red Army offensive operations. At the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, hundreds of rocket launchers supported the Soviet defense and counterattack against the largest tank battle in history. The Guards mortar units, as they were still officially called, had evolved from a handful of experimental batteries into a massive arm of the Soviet artillery establishment. They were so important that the People's Commissariat for General Machine Building was actually renamed the People's Commissariat for Mortar Weapons in November of 1941, effectively creating a government ministry dedicated primarily to producing Katyushas and their ammunition. No other single weapon type in the Red Army had its own ministry. As the Red Army pushed westward through Poland and into Germany itself, the Katyusha accompanied every major offensive. During the liberation of Warsaw, the crossing of the Vistula River, and the grinding advance through East Prussia, rocket batteries provided the opening salvos that softened enemy positions before waves of Soviet infantry and armor rolled through. The Guards mortar regiments had become professional and experienced units by this point, a far cry from Flerov's hastily assembled experimental battery 3 years earlier. Each regiment was organized with dozens of launchers, anti-aircraft guns for self-defense, and dedicated ammunition convoys to keep the rockets flowing. They had their own reconnaissance elements to identify targets and their own fire direction procedures. The crude improvisation of 1941 had become a refined, if still brutally blunt, instrument of industrial warfare. The Katyusha was not a precision instrument. It never became one. Right up to the end of the war, it remained what it had always been: a blunt, screaming, area denial weapon that turned patches of landscape into wastelands of fire and steel fragments. But the numbers told a story that accuracy never could. By 1945, over 500 Katyusha batteries were operating across the Eastern Front. When the Red Army launched its final assault on Berlin in April of 1945, massed Katyusha launchers were part of the opening bombardment. Rows of trucks lined up behind the Soviet front lines, their launch rails elevated and loaded. When they fired, the night sky turned orange. The rockets screamed over the heads of advancing Soviet infantry and smashed into the shattered streets and buildings where German defenders waited. The firepower, combined with the noise and the choking smoke they produced, induced panic among the soldiers trying to hold the city. For the men defending Berlin, the sound of the Katyusha was the sound of the war ending, whether they wanted it to or not. When the fighting finally stopped, the Katyusha did not disappear. The Soviet Union kept refining the concept through the 1950s and 60s. The BM-21 Grad, meaning hail, became the direct successor, capable of firing 4,122mm rockets in under 20 seconds, with a range of 20 kilometers. The Grad and its descendants are still in use today in conflicts around the world. After the war, original Katyushas and later models were exported to every corner of the Soviet sphere of influence. They saw combat in Korea, Vietnam, the Yom Kippur War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the conflicts in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, China, Egypt, Iraq, North Korea, Cuba, and dozens of other nations fielded some version of the weapon. The design philosophy, cheap to build, simple to operate, devastating in volume, and mobile enough to shoot and relocate, became the template for an entire category of modern weaponry called multiple launch rocket systems. The Katyusha concept proved so influential that even Western nations developed their own versions. The American M270 multiple launch rocket system, which became a NATO standard during the Cold War, traces its design philosophy directly back to the principles the Soviets established with the BM-13: mass fire, mobility, rapid displacement. The idea that started with a handful of struggling engineers in a Leningrad laboratory ended up shaping how every major military in the world thinks about rocket artillery. In 1991, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev issued a decree posthumously awarding the title Hero of Socialist Labor to 6 of the original engineers who had developed the rocket technology behind the Katyusha at the RNII, including I.T. Klemyonov and G.E. Langemak. Many of these men had been executed during Stalin's Purges in the late 1930s, accused of sabotage or disloyalty, killed before they ever saw their creation used in combat. The weapon that helped save the Soviet Union in its darkest hour was built by men that same government had murdered. That is not an irony you find in many engineering textbooks. Today, roughly 21 original Katyusha launchers survive around the world, most of them sitting on pedestals as monuments or resting in military museums. They look modest, just metal rails bolted to the back of old trucks. Nothing about them suggests the terror they inflicted. But for anyone who fought on the Eastern Front during World War II, the Katyusha was never about what it looked like. It was about what it sounded like. That howl, that unearthly, rising scream tearing across a frozen battlefield, followed by a few seconds of silence, and then a world made entirely of fire. The Germans heard it and gave it a name that honored its horror: Stalin's organ. The Soviets heard it and gave it a name that honored something gentler: a girl in a song, standing on a steep riverbank, singing about love and longing while the war raged on. Both names were right, and both names stuck, because the Katyusha was never just a weapon. It was the sound of the Eastern Front itself. If you found this story worth your time, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which World War II weapon you think deserves its own documentary next.